Hello, Internet. Gino, that Pinguino Grieco here again with another episode of Deep Listens. And today is going to be a bit of an odd episode because we've got two games to talk about, both free-to-play games. We're going to be talking about Sisyphus Reborn and Port of Call. And as always, I'm going to be discussing these games with Billy Sisyphus Rothert.
Thanks, everybody, for tuning in. I mean, I think that nickname is fitting because among all members of this show, I'm probably the one who can repeat mindless, repetitive tasks with little to no incremental advantage and be just totally fine with it.
Yeah, you would find the optimal way to roll the boulder up the hill, and we would tell you, Billy, it's never going to get to the top. And you'd be like, no. I'm getting to the same point faster. I'm failing faster. Which I feel is appropriate. So, we are also joined by Peter, also Sisyphus Busby.
What's going on, everybody? I think if I had to pick one of the punishments from the Greek pantheon, I'd probably pick Sisyphus. It's better than Tantalus. It's better than better than Prometheus. Because Sisyphus, at least I have to think, gets pretty yoked from pushing
He's
the
getting
boulder
jacked.
up. Yeah, right. He gets gains.
Think of those traps, man.
Right. He's probably he's not getting anything, but he's at least ripped, which is good enough for me.
Yeah, I guess Atlas too. Atlas,
yeah,
he's pretty yoked.
Yeah.
All shoulders. Yeah, all shoulders and lats there, baby.
So, in honor of last podcast's fact on Liechtenstein, in honor of Shark Week, I'm going to have a shark fact for this week in honor of the release of the Meg, which is apparently terrible.
What?
Yeah, I know. Who would have thought? But apparently
Don't you tell
terrible.
me that.
I don't have any context here.
It's a movie about megalodons.
A big shark.
But apparently, one of killer whales' favorite things to eat are great white shark livers. So, like, a group of killer whales will get together and just wreck a great white shark, eat its liver, and then just sort of leave the rest behind. So, like, if you think, like, great white sharks, pretty badass, nothing can step to killer whales.
Yeah, killer whales, it's us and them.
Yeah.
In terms of the things they kill for fun.
Yes.
Man, that's some foie gras shit.
Yeah, that's some Hannibal Lecter shit right there.
And, like, I think the only thing that's keeping killer whales from just being the most dominant species on the planet is that they haven't learned how to square up to humans on land that well yet.
Yeah. You just wait, though.
Give it time.
Free Willy was chilling. We put a wall up, and it went over it.
I'm certainly not going to grant, killer whales like higher order mental states, but they could be higher in the food chain than us.
I saw an article like yesterday about a killer whale that was carrying its dead calf for days because it was grieving its death. So it was swimming with this basically carrying this corpse because it was so sad that its baby had died. But hey, I'm sure it was just a coincidence.
It might have just been a trap to try to lure in a killer whale, though, or a great white.
A great white? Oh, yeah, I'm sure this is my baby, but really want that liver.
I mean, I could imagine whales being that savage. Like, hey, I know my spawn just died, but this would be great bait for that just tasty great white shark liver.
It's telling that you could see them being that savage, but not that kind. And so, it's time to see if we have any emails. We do not. We have no feedback this week, but if you want
wait, Gino, did you check the YouTube comments?
Let me check the YouTube comments.
The standard way people communicate with each other.
Did you?
I did.
We need to be thorough, Gino.
And nothing.
Oh, okay.
Yep. Yeah, we did have someone say in the YouTube comments that it sounded like there was a fart on one of our podcasts, and I would like to say we never fart.
Never.
Oh,
I don't even have a butt.
Actually, we do have an email. Let me. I just found it. Let me find this email.
Just in response to the farty sound, as the editor of this show, lots of times, just if we touch our mic or our, headset or whatever, it can create a lot of different sounds. So I try to edit those all out.
In this case,
yeah. I'm pretty sure it was when my sister came into the room for something.
Okay, so we do have an email, and if you want to get in touch with the show, you can do so at Deep Listens Pod on Twitter. We're trying to get our comment section worked out, but eventually you'll be able to comment there if you can't right now. deeplistenspodcast at gmail.com. You can send an email, or at deeplistenspod on Twitter. But this comes in as an email from Zombie Pie. Sometimes he's on the YouTube comments. Sometimes he just sends me messages. This comes from friend of the show, Zombie Pie. He says, "Dear Deep Listens crew, before we get in deep with the content of my email, I first want to preface this letter took a great deal of effort and time to compose. This letter is written with a lot of love and with the intention of providing you, hopefully, some appreciated feedback about a podcast you recorded a while ago."
Better be about Ape
I wish. First, and there's no point dancing around the issue, I think your Brutal Legends podcast is an unfortunate reminder of the limitations of a podcast hosted by three white males. In particular, your conversation about genres of music that warrant the Brutal Legends treatment. I know you all love talking about societal and philosophical topics from an academic perspective, but this might have been one of your biggest missteps. I cannot preface enough how music is a part of certain cultures, and your categorization of which ones deserve a video game adaptation comes across as cultural gatekeeping. I know this was not your intent, and that's why I am writing this letter. For me, any genre of music could warrant a Brutal Legends-like game. For a genre like hip-hop, it shares its roots with other forms of traditionally African-American music like jazz, blues, and soul. I want to mention those last three definitely deserve a look by the video game industry. While many people are apt to bemoan the state of this genre today, it is one of the only ways people of color can express their life experiences to the entire world. Calling one genre the same thing over and over again ignores the facts of racism, intolerance, and economic inequality are placed in the forefront thanks to music when other means of communication are not viable. Furthermore, what about traditional music? The traditional music of Asian and African cultures are steeped in underrepresented religions, cultures, or people. And let's revisit the parallel you drew to the Def Jam games. What's wrong with a series of games where people of color live out a power fantasy? If anime fighting game enthusiasts are allowed to get a game every year where they can simulate their wildest dreams, why can't people of color have the same? This is part of the reason why the theatrical releases of Black Panther, why the theatrical release of Black Panther was such a milestone. Also, the creators of Def Jam worked side by side with rappers that they sought to simulate, and no one does this anymore. Not wrong. My sentiment also applies to just about every genre of music. Say what you will about J-pop or K-pop, but both are important stalwarts to the societal and personal identities of millions of people. It's a damn shame people who are invested in such music are stuck playing rhythm games. And it's not just about culture. I have friends and family that came out as a result of Elton John or Freddie Mercury. How many music adventure games can you think of that respectfully emulates the music of the LGBTQIA community? All of these communities have little to no representation in the video game industry, and I cannot help but view this as an unfortunate circumstance. And again, I just want to say this is written with nothing but love and care for all of you. A lot of these issues cannot be blamed on the Deep Listens podcast, but I want to remind you that you really need to be careful when talking about cultural topics like music. You have a platform that many would dream of having, and I can only hope you use it for the benefit of everyone. P.S. Tell Pete that whenever he glows about pro-communist writings, I will use the podcast comments to link to pro-capitalist writings. So far, I have linked your community to I Pencil by Leonard E. Reed, as well as Free to Choose by the economists Milton and Rose D. Friedman. I have even tried to convince Gino that the tragedy of the commons is a bunch of bullshit that never happened. As I always say, fight fire with fire. Thank you, ZP. So, what do you think?
So I think it's always a fair criticism to point out that we are three white men. I think we potentially forget it. But I feel like our point, if I recall correctly, it was more that like rock music presents like a narrative and an environment in a way other genres don't. So like I don't, fair to CP's point, I don't know enough about K-pop or J-pop to say whether or not they create the same sort of narratives that rock music tends to do.
Yeah, and I think that the larger critique, I mean, it's a combination of analysis and critique of Brutal Legend and of metal specifically. There is a lot of thematic overlap and consistency that made it easy. It's not that these other genres aren't deserving of an analysis or a love letter in the way that Brutal Legend was.
Right.
I think every genre of music deserves that. I just think it's harder. Like, you have to, as a writer, do more work. Metal, all those metal album covers have a tone, like, of the, 70s, 80s, even some 90s bands, they are steeped in the same bones and chains and metal sort of aesthetic. So once you have that kind of larger headcanon, producing something that is both tonally resonant and how that is tonally resonant, I think it's a lot easier as a writer. But I think that is some treatment that could totally be done with just about any other genre, and an expert in that genre could accomplish it.
All right, so I think ZP makes fair points about our privilege and the lens through which we see the world. I think ZP is talking about something that is relevant as far as like how cultures can express through art, but he's just off base here, at least in my answer to the initial question during that podcast. The way that I was answering the question was which genres of music are particularly apt to be turned into game form. And it's true that any game can be made from any genre of music, but some are going to have an easier time making that game than others, which is only tied to like mechanical similarities in some genres of music over others. Not that one genre is more deserving or should be represented differently. So like ZP's making good points, but they shouldn't be directed at us at all.
Well, I wouldn't go that far. I think the critique is valid.
I would go that far.
Okay, that's a distinction between the two of us.
You did just go that far.
You did. I know. I'm saying I disagree with you, and I think that it's a valid critique. My point during the podcast and now is not that metal deserves it more or anything in that way. It is that heavy metal and the metal that they were specifically speaking to basically exists in that form like for 20 years or 30 years and is almost gone now. There's not a lot of new stuff in that large culturally hegemonic way that it was during the 70s, 80s, 90s. Like it would be like making a disco game. There's what the canon is because there isn't more coming out that's constantly redefining it. Whereas I think for healthier genres or genres that are not kind of trapped in nostalgia, it can be harder to pin down exactly what the feel of that genre is because it's still being defined and redefined. So I think a disco game would likewise be easier because it's easier to capture something that really had a 10-year heyday and then was basically left for dead. It would be harder if you tried to then tie that into modern reimaginings of disco. If you put Daft Punk and Earth, Wind, and Fire in the same spectrum, then all of a sudden...
That'd be great.
Yeah, and it's accurate. Like, Daft Punk uses a lot of disco beats, and they're basically making high-end disco, which is amazing. But it changes the parameters of the game you'd be making. It changes your perspective on what counts as canon. And so I think you could make a game for all sorts of genres, but I think it's easier when it's a genre that is older, that is encompassed in a set beginning and end, and has a unifying theme, like unifying aesthetic, unifying language. I think, and even unifying beats can also be really useful. But I think that all of those genres that ZP mentioned are obviously worthy. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think any music counts.
I'm gonna agree that like any music in any genre counts, like you said, and is a valid genre. I'm going to push not necessarily back at you, but back at the discussion and say something probably controversial. But I don't think music or a genre or almost any form of art has the capacity to have the quality like deserving or like what was the other word that you used? Deserve and something else that was similar to deserve. I don't know. It's not that important. I don't think any art can like deserve any kind of treatment. It's not how it should be taken. It's just if it is an art form, whether it's writing, music, film, sculpture, anything. It can't, like, you can't say a piece of art deserves better anything. It exists and it expresses something, and people take meaning from it if it exists for them, and other people don't because it doesn't have context that resonates with them. That's fine, but I don't think art can deserve anything. So saying that a genre of music deserves something, I think, is placing like a privilege on an art that just is inherently not there. Like, if you try to give art too much like agency, I think that's taking a wrong step into what art's supposed to be. It's supposed to be something that I guess is organic and like explodes from someone from like, I guess, like igniting something inside of them that they cannot express any other way, so they do it in art. And that deserves merit and credit, but I don't think the art itself deserves a response from anyone.
I would push back. I guess my understanding of art is that is a cultural product, and
agree,
is a product of a person in a time and place. And because I believe very strongly in human pursuits, I think that as an artifact of a larger culture, I think most genres of music deserve the same level of respect and the same level of reverence. And a game, in this case, ZP is putting like a game representation of that genre, of that culture, as kind of an emblem of how valuable or how revered different genres of music are. And I think that if any one culture is deserving, I think all of them are.
All right, so that's specifically what I'm pushing back on, and I'll agree that maybe art deserves respect and music deserves respect, and the artist needs to have a level of respect and credit. They're all valid. I don't think any form of artwork deserves a certain slice of the pie of representation, because I think as soon as you say if one form of art is like valid, then they all are. Sorry, that's not the right word I should use. If one form of art deserves this much slice of like public view, then they all get the same slice of public view. That's like just art communism, or like art, like that's like the exact kind of like worldwide like hegemony that we don't want, and that art's trying to fight against.
Pete, do you have anything to add?
Well, yeah, I mean, Billy seems to think that like some of this exists in a vacuum, so it seems like whether or not art like there's no ontological question such that art deserves certain amounts of representation. It's always a power move. It's always a social move. Like whatever group has the most power, that art form gets the most airtime, let's say. So I do want art communism. I do want all of them to get the same sort of, let's just say, airplay.
Yeah, that's basically my stance as well. It's not that it's – I think that the market forces and cultural forces that produced Brutal Legend – and Brutal Legend was not like a resounding success. That was one of the last big games that Double Fine made.
They run out of money. Like we said, the game sort of quit halfway through.
It was not a resounding success, and in a lot of ways, the Def Jam games were a bigger success than Brutal Legend. So it's not saying that Brutal Legend was the product of a culture that was willing to support it, and it was the only culture that would have been capable of producing a game like this. But I think that Brutal Legend's positioning allowed it to exist, and I would like a similar positioning for other games, especially for musical genres that do not necessarily exist in the U.S. in such a specific way, or in Japan or Europe. Some of the continents and countries that really produce a lot of video games. Like, I don't know who would make the South American kind of cultural music game. Some descendants of the Mayans or descendants of the Aztecs. Like, I don't know who would make that game when the economics don't necessarily line up and the availability of technology and publishing isn't there. But I would like someone who has that dream, regardless of where they are, to be able to pursue it and to make it. That's my only stance. And I think if Billy, last word, and then we need to start talking about these.
Yeah, we do.
For the podcast.
So I think that culturally there are these swings back and forth of sort of how, whether it's a town, a city, a country, worldwide, how we think about. And this is so hard to say because this is like on the fly, but I'll just skip that part and get to the phrase where I would say, right now we're in a swing where it's so popular to have the idea that everything needs equal representation, and that's ultimately a great thing for all the following areas: race, class, gender, orientation, political view, creed, like those are all amazing. We should have increased and equal representation to provide opportunity for all these various platforms that art can come from. But when I think of art itself, like, sure, I want every place that art can come from to be equally cultivated. I want every place that art can come from to be equally cultivated, and that would promote every, like I said, place art can come from deserves equal representation. But the art itself, the finished product, if that is what is like, if like the pie chart is always cut evenly for all types of art, then the art that's like truly excellent, that should sweep the world or sweep the playing field at that time, that really captures people, doesn't get to do what it's going to do. And like, so that's mediocre gets represented when it's not moving people. Like art, I think art has a purpose beyond just being something to be consumed. And if a piece of art should dominate culture, it's doing that for a reason. And true, in history, people that had power chose what art dominated culture. But I don't think that's happening now. And if we're talking about, all right, you can push back if you want to, but maybe later. I think right now that if you go on the internet, and there's literally more genres of music than you can count, but in the 90s, you listened to what was on the radio, and you didn't have much of a choice, right? Your option for finding different music was go to like the most podunk record shop and say, what album is no one buying? And that's the weird music that I like now. But now I can literally binge 30 different genres of music in one day. That's the kind of change that I'm pointing at here.
Yeah, we need to stop. Let's just say we think everything Billy says is wrong. And then
great.
All I wanted to say is if you're telling me that Post Malone is dominating the charts right now because he is the best musician, I respectfully disagree.
Anyway, all right, I'm done.
If he's climbing atop the ruined corpses of his enemies because he is just out singing and out writing them.
Post Malone, what is greatest in life?
All right. I think that's enough for right now. Thank you, ZP. Thank you, listeners who have written in. Please continue writing in.
Yes.
We will do a plug for writing in. And also, I haven't done a plug for rating and reviewing in a while. Do that.
Yeah.
Go to the iTunes thing, hit the 5-star button. We get more people to listen every time you guys do that. And I see the numbers. I see what happens. So please.
Gino's looking.
I look. And when a person likes and subscribes, an angel gets its wings. So, without further ado, let's discuss Sisyphus Reborn and Port of Call. Let's start with Sisyphus Reborn because I think this is the more interesting of the two games and probably the one we'll have more to say about. So, Billy, what's Sisyphus Reborn?
Oh, well, Gino.
Man on the street, Billy Rothert.
Hey, I'm coming at you from the dimly lit cave here. And we're talking about... Wow, there's like a little puddle and a stalactite, and that's about it. All right, so there's not much to the quote-unquote story of Sisyphus Reborn. In fact, it'd probably be inaccurate to say that there is a plot or a story. It's really just a narrative experience that you, the player, take your nameless avatar through. But what we get is essentially a nameless, genderless, ageless figure that we assume the role of in a cave. The figure has some simple thoughts like, I'm here. I've kind of always been here, but I haven't thought much about it, and I wonder if I got up and moved, what would I do? And this entity that now sort of assumes new agency begins to explore the cave, interacts with some people, asks some questions, and goes on a sort of journey of self-discovery, mostly aiming their lines of inquiry at who am I, who are you, why am I here, what's the point in this, what looks to be some type of purgatory or afterlife setting. And that's basically it. I mean, that's almost the whole game.
Yeah. And so you're kind of this floating ghost that seems to be in maybe an afterlife. It's unclear. You're in a cave, and you're just trying to find a purpose. You're trying to find a way out, I guess. And Pete, why did you pick this game? What did you see?
Well, various reasons. The title sort of caught me on right away. So if anybody, I alluded to this at the beginning, but I think it's worth being a little bit more explicit. Sisyphus was a dude. I think he was a king. And he tried to cross the Greek gods. Never a good idea. So Zeus killed him, and they sent him to an afterlife. I think they sent him to Tartarus. But it doesn't really matter where they sent him. And they said, Zeus was like, all right, bro, you're going to spend the rest of eternity rolling this rock up the hill. And you'll keep rolling it no matter what you do. Every time as you sort of approach the top, inevitably it'll roll back down. So it was Sisyphus' job to keep rolling this rock up this hill for all of eternity. So I like Greek mythology. I like philosophy. And this is sort of a game where the two seemed, at least on the surface, to intertwine. I also noticed it was very short, which isn't necessarily a plus. But I thought, let's see how short you can make a game. Let's strip things down and see sort of what it's doing, how it's operating within this unique sort of shorter context.
Yeah. So this game, I think, starts off pretty early on, just making it very clear it's going to be asking a bunch of philosophical questions. Mm-hmm. And there's not much else going on. It's a point-and-click adventure game. You only ever pick up, 3 items.
Yeah, there's some small puzzling in the very beginning in the cave, but it ends pretty quick.
Yeah, you pick up a rock, you smash a stalactite so you can get through a gap, you pick up the stalactite so you can leave the cave, and then you eventually can make a shovel at some point. Mm-hmm. But other than that, there's not a lot of other point-and-click adventuring to happen. Once you start off in the cave, and I think that's a nice shout-out to Plato. Plato's The Cave.
Yeah, I'd assume so, the allegory of the cave.
Yeah. Billy or Pete, do you want to explain the cave for those of our listeners who are not familiar with Plato's The Cave?
Billy, can you do it shortly and quickly? Yes, I can.
All right, take a shot.
So in Plato's allegory of the cave, this is really a teaching construct that helps people understand the general idea behind different levels of awareness and mental. Mental. What's the word I'm looking for? Awareness is probably the best word for it. A person in the quote-unquote cave starts off watching these shadows. Don't know where the shadows are coming from. They're sort of looking at essentially a puppet show of shadows on the wall. Once the person gains a higher level of consciousness, they can look to the left and to the right and see that there are other people watching shadows too, other persons watching the shadows. At another level of consciousness, they look back and say, oh, these shadows are made by little cutout figures, and there's a fire behind me. I never noticed that before, and it's the fire casting light across the shadows that makes this sort of puppet dance. And then a person gets more mental awareness, and they realize that I'm essentially in this cave. Well, how do I get out of here? And at higher and higher and higher levels of awareness, you begin leaving the cave. Once you reach a sort of mental awakening or mental or spiritual awakening, you can leave the cave. And the way it's described, at first, when you leave the cave, it's so bright that you're blinded, essentially alluding to if you reach a certain level of mental awareness, it can be painful at some point, and you'll want to turn away, and some people might go back into the cave because it hurts so much. But when those people who are ready and capable of that level of mental awareness are accustomed to the light, they see a much more vivid, beautiful, lively experience, much better than shadow puppets in a cave. But those that are still in the cave don't know any of this, so the person who is mentally sort of awakened, it then becomes their responsibility to help others realize that they're in the cave and bring them out to the light as well. That's kind of like the nutshell version of the allegory of the cave, and it's all aiming towards a person's like mental and spiritual awakening.
Yes, and Plato had an idea about perfect forms, that everything in the world is a kind of a copy of some idealized version that's out there in the ether. And so the shadows that you're watching on the cave wall are kind of these reflections or these shadows cast off of perfect ideal objects. So every chicken you see is a shadow of the chicken.
It's always capital
chicken.
C chicken. It's capital C chicken versus lowercase c chicken.
Exactly. And so once you leave the cave, you find the chicken, and then you know that all the other chickens were shit. And this is the one true chicken.
Mm-hmm.
So how do you guys think this allegory plays out? Because I think it definitely follows in terms of that that story, that parable. You start off in the cave, dig your way out, and then you're blinded, and you're in the desert, pretty much. So this odd desert. And I kind of really like the effect that they used. The game is pretty much hand-drawn, like stick figures almost. But once you're in the desert, the world just kind of undulates and pixelates here and there, because I guess technologically maybe they didn't have that much more than a couple of effects to apply to their graphics to make it look like it was moving. But I think it actually worked.
Yeah, if you walk far enough in one direction, too, I don't know if you guys bothered to, but everything just sort of breaks down even further.
Yeah,
so
I did that.
Everything's shaking, lines are flying all over the place. It starts to look really cool.
Exactly. And you wander for a bit, and you eventually find some people digging. Pete, what are the diggers?
What are the diggers? Like in philosophical terms?
Yeah, both.
So
literally and figuratively.
Literally, they're diggers. What they do is they dig holes. Once the holes are dug, they can then fill in the holes and then start digging new holes. That's basically everything these people do with their lives. So the way this, I don't even know if you can call it a society, the way this existence works is that you have two choices. You can dig or you can do nothing. And when you do nothing, eventually you just sort of cease to be a person. You just sort of stand around. You almost become like a tree.
Yeah.
So the diggers are the people who have made the choice, like, all right, I have the choice between digging and nothing. I guess I'll dig.
Yeah, you find these diggers. One digger, most of them only know how to say, I dig.
Yep.
You'll ask them questions and they have no answers.
Like, they'll say things like, where are we? And they'll say, we're here. Or, who are you? And they'll go, I am me. Those are the sort of answers you're getting from the diggers.
And one of them still has a consciousness enough to tell you, hey, there's this pyramid, and if you go to the pyramid and ask it questions, it will give you answers, and it always answers my questions. So you go to this pyramid in the desert, and you have to ring some bells that kind of match the bell, a tone that's playing when you're in that area. And once you do, the side of the pyramid opens up, and you can go inside, and there's a person in there. And the guy inside is apparently one of the oldest beings to exist in this world, and has figured out how to create a pyramid. He's done everything. He's existed in this purgatory forever. And so he's tried everything, and he says, look, I've been everywhere, I've done everything. There are two options. Let me show you the two options. And he shows you this herd of people who have given up. They've decided to be near other people and then to just not dig, not do anything. And then they eventually almost turn to stone. They become pack animals almost. Mm-hmm. They don't think, they don't talk. And then there are the diggers who kind of create meaning out of nothing, but it is a frivolous, meaningless existence. It is the most cursory level of meaning. And these are the two options he presents you. And he says, you can also wander out into the desert, but that will drive you mad, and there's nothing out there. And you keep, at least I kept trying to present different options, right? What if I do this? What if I do this? What if I do this?
Like, nope.
There's got to be something else.
There isn't.
Like, what if I just keep digging down? Well, you'll hit the bedrock, and then once you hit the bedrock, then you'll be stuck down there with no way to leave.
Our tools are not I think the reason that this person gives was the bedrock is harder than any tools that we have up here, so we cannot penetrate the bedrock.
They're harder than the rocks they make their shovels out of.
Yeah.
Yeah, and you end up at the bottom of a hole trapped down there, and then you can't do anything, and you become stationary and alone, which is even worse than being stationary.
You could always dig yourself out.
Yeah, you just dig up.
Yeah, that's...
You ever played Dig Dug, Gino?
I did. But what happens when you
Dig
run into
Dug
the
could get out.
What happens when you run into the pukas or the figars? What then, Billy?
You just dig them.
You dig them.
Do
you know, so, like, Dig Dug and Galaga take place in the same universe?
I did know that.
Like, it's weirdly canon that all those games are. And Dig Dug actually takes place after Galaga.
What?
Yeah.
Dig Douglas is underneath the ground?
He's in Galaga's future.
Wow.
We're all in Galaga's future.
So the climax of the game really is you get to make this decision. You get to decide, will I dig? Will I do nothing? Or you can also quit if you walk far enough, but that doesn't really count.
Yeah, if you walk far enough, the game's just like, oh, you want to give up.
It's like, oh, stop playing? Okay. So those are your two, really, endings.
Yeah, so what did you guys take on these choices?
Billy, why don't you start?
I should probably go last.
Okay, that's fine. So let me just give a little bit of the philosophical underpinning here, then. So there's a whole bunch of different sort of discrete philosophies rolled into one. This is sort of a jumble of a few things. But I think the easiest sort of lens to look at it through is sort of like a branch of nihilism. So the idea here is that there's no sort of universal meaning, right? It's not as if, like, you know, the Lord God on high or some sort of extra dimensional being, right? Cthulhu isn't like, here's how you should live, right? So it's up to you. Whatever you choose, that's the meaning of your life. There's no way to get any sort of meaning beyond what you make. And it just so happens that your choice in here is to dig. So because you made that choice, in virtue of making that choice, it then becomes meaningful. That's a philosophical argument this game's trying to make. My problem with that, beyond sort of, well, you know, philosophically or not, my problem with the way the game does it is that it's very, very clear that the game wants you to make one decision, namely to dig. But within the context of this philosophy, any decision you make would be equally meaningful. So the very fact of doing nothing should be as meaningful as the decision to dig. The fact that it's physical labor doesn't really mean anything, unless we're looking at this from a Marxist lens, which I don't think the game wants us to do.
Yeah, and the game, it makes very clear that it wants you to dig and also steers you in such a direction that once you start making these choices, it basically chastises you for not choosing dig.
Yeah, and you have to dig in one specific place, too.
You don't. You can dig anywhere.
Okay, you don't, but to get the good ending, you do.
Yes. I started digging just, like, in sand, and the game was like, oh, do you want to just keep doing this forever? Yes, no. And I chose I would go to the good spot. You have to go back to the cave and dig in the cave. And did everyone pick that ending? Did everyone dig in the
eventually.
cave and then tunnel through the earth?
It wasn't the first ending I picked, but I'll talk about that later.
I wanted to just quit. I thought that was like wander the desert forever, but apparently they didn't like that.
Yeah. They didn't like that choice. They don't like the choice where you just dig forever. They don't like the choice where you just stand with the crowd of nothings. And I think that the argument they're making in terms of societal organization is kind of interesting, that some people just choose to go with the flow and stay in a herd, and they are looked down upon. There are some people who create meaning, but the thing they are creating meaning out of is inherently meaningless. So they are also fools. The real truth is to kind of do what the people who are making menial labor for themselves are doing, but like in a slightly smarter way.
Yeah.
And then you're good.
But
you've made the right choice.
That's the problem, right? Is the game's operating on two contradictory levels. One, there's no universal meaning. Okay. But two, there is a better way to do things. But that better way to do things then relies on, okay, what's our larger standard of judgment here? Which the game has already told us there isn't one.
And at the end, once you've made this choice to kind of go back to the cave and dig all the way down through the bottom, it's clear that, one, if this cave exists, why did no one else find it? Like this dude who tells you give up everything. How did he not find it? Yeah, and there's water that's kind of rushing in from out of the cave. Where's the water coming from? Because it's a desert outside. Like, the cave is the only place with water or anything resembling safety, I would say. And it just so happens that your character was the only one who knew about this cave's existence or took advantage of it. It's odd to me. It seems like a narrative gap. And it turns out the right choice is to go back to the beginning and then just act like everyone else, but you picked the right place to dig. It's almost a technocratic answer, you know? It's not that these people are doing things incorrectly. It's that they're doing the right thing, but just in slightly the wrong way. And if we just tweaked it a little, everyone would be happy. But the thing that you're doing is still arbitrarily digging.
Yeah, if personal choice is the vehicle by which meaning is created, let's say, it doesn't matter where you dig. Wherever you choose is equally valid from the personal perspective, which is the only perspective that matters, according to the game's philosophy.
But I think the game's philosophy is more that the act of digging is not the important part. It's digging with a purpose beyond creating holes and filling them. It's having a deeper internal drive to your digging. You have to just have a better justification for your digging. Like, I wanted to just go down the big hole and be like, okay, I'm going to find out if this rock is in fact harder than this rock that I'm carrying in my hands. But the game was like, no, you can't try that.
But, like, even the language of, like, better here doesn't make any sense.
Quick question, Gino. If you just dug anywhere in the desert, could you make a hole?
No, it didn't.
It just kind of did like the same animation of like dig a tiny bit, but it never actually progressed.
The game just dig forever. Yes, no. It doesn't even let you dig that long, really.
It's like 4 or 5 digs in the same spot. It gives you a prompt.
Yep, pretty much.
What happens if you say yes?
Game ends.
Do you see a credits, or does it just like exit the game? Does like credits roll?
Maybe you don't see the tree of knowledge.
Yeah, you don't see the good ending, quote unquote.
Yeah.
So Billy, what did you do?
So I left the cave. I talked to the people. I went to the pyramid guy. I went to the madness place.
The edge of the edge of the desert.
Yeah. Then
That's my favorite location in Mad Max, the madness place.
I went back to the pyramid guy, and so what happens next occurred after I talked to the pyramid guy, but before I built the shovel. And what I did was, this was yesterday. I got up from my computer and I went into the kitchen and I made a peanut butter and apple sandwich, jazz apples. And Pepperidge Farm bread. Whew.
Just apples?
Yeah, peanut butter and apple sandwich.
Okay.
Like peanut butter sandwich with apples in the middle.
Yeah, I got
it. It's just, if you haven't tried it, give it a shot. It really just gives it's a little crunch in the middle, and then you don't have that stuck in your mouth peanut butter sensation. You can actually chew it properly. Well, I got in my car and I got my kayak and I went to the river and I spent about 3 hours there, and then I came back and I didn't play this game for that much longer. I YouTubed the endings, but that was my ending of Sisyphus Reborn.
So, when you were making your sandwich, it caused an ending?
I think when I ate the sandwich on a sandy bank of a flowing river. So that I think was the real ending of Sisyphus Reborn. When I said, I'm going to turn this game off and do something else instead.
Why?
Because I think that everything you and Gino said is true about the game itself, but I saw this as two options. You can do nothing, which is an available option for everyone, has the option to just do nothing and be stagnant. Or I could be doing the same repetitive motion over and over again, and that kind of resonated me, not just in the game Sisyphus Reborn, but then I looked at my desktop and my screen, and I was like, if I were not playing this game, I'd just be playing some other game or fucking around on YouTube or listening to music, and I'd be basically doing the same repetitive motion over and over again. And this game was asking me, like, a bunch of yes-no choices. What do you choose? What do you choose? Oh, you only have two options. You can either do nothing or you can dig holes forever. And I said, no, there's a third option. Fuck you. Bye. And that's how I beat the game.
Yeah, and
I mean, I'm not saying this sarcastically. Like, I think that's what this game's really about. I really think that the game was, at least for me, said, you have two choices here. But secretly they weren't telling me, you could also just get up and leave and do something else.
Well,
and I think me
the
doing
game
that
does explicitly do that, because if you walk to the edge of the desert, the game's like, quit?
Yeah, and that I didn't actually hit yes there, but that would have been the ending that I chose if I didn't choose, I think, the best ending, which is what I did.
So did you see the watercolor
ending
as well?
I actually just, like, to prove the point so staunchly, like, once I went to the river in real life in my city, I haven't opened Sisyphus Reborn again. So I YouTubed the endings of the game.
But Billy, why? My question when I ask why this game? Like, quitting is an ending that you could apply to any game you wanted, right? It's an option for any game you play.
Yeah.
So why pursue it in this one when it doesn't really seem like you've pursued it in a whole lot of other ones we've played, or even that you play yourself?
Right. Because there was some in other games that I can quit anytime, and I'll couch what I'm about to say in a actually no, let me say it first and then I'll qualify it in a specific way. So other games that I play have things that are yet to be explored, and while there are things that have yet to be explored in a game, I will continue to explore them. Once there's nothing left to explore in a game, I'm done. And that's something that didn't always exist for me because I played Dota and other games like it that literally have no end, and there is endless things to explore, but that's bad and unhealthy. So now I only play games. I've made like a rule for myself that I only play games that have an end to them, like a final boss or a credit screen. And when I came to this like mental realization about I had this third option, I so truly thought, oh, I've just found the best ending of the game. In a similar way that, like, maybe think about like a Stanley Parable, right? You could have looked for all the endings of a Stanley Parable, but like the best ending would be to break the cycle as much as you can, right? And we didn't think about Stanley Parable as something that should be so closely examined. Like, yeah, sure, it's got this really cool like gimmick. It's like a sit down, play it once or twice, with some friends, and they sort of get the message. Sisyphus Reborn is like that too. You just kind of play it, you get the idea, and I just got it at that moment, and I think by choosing my response to the game, I'm getting the most out of it. I found my final boss, which was the little button, actually it was Alt F4 was the final boss. I smashed him, and I beat the game.
You just left me with another question, right? So here you didn't explore everything, because like you said, you went to YouTube.
Hold instead,
let me finish the question.
Yeah, go ahead.
But instead, you made a claim. You found the best ending.
Yeah.
So now I just returned to my previous question. Okay, what makes this the best ending in this case? Whereas in other games, quitting is not the best ending.
So this then comes to what I value. Mm-hmm. And as some of you know, listeners and, Pete and Gino, one of the things that is most core to my belief system is free will and the ability to choose. And I'll add to free will not just choice in a determinist or pseudo-determinist or compatibilist perspective. I mean like the ability to do otherwise. And that's like a phrase that is thrown around in free will discussions, having the ability to do otherwise. I did have the ability to do otherwise, and I think that's like the biggest Easter egg and best ending for me. But it's not the best ending for everyone. It's only the best ending for me because that's what I value. Just like in any game that has like a morality system, if you play Mass Effect and you go full Paragon or for full Renegade, you could get what is the best ending for you. I don't think Mass Effect tells you what's the best ending. I haven't explored them all, so maybe they do, but lots of games that have choices that matter might have a subjective best ending, not an objective best ending.
Sure. I think that's fair. So, last question on Sisyphus Reborn. Do you think the name is accurate? So I know that the digging is technically Sisyphean, but what else is? Like, this game seems a lot more a parable on Plato's The Cave. There's no boulder rolling. Do you think the Sisyphus parable even necessarily applies here? I
think the parable of the cave is nothing more than like a quick nod. I don't think, like, I'm not going to go so far as to say, you know, like I've said some pretty crazy things in the past, like Talos Principle is a game that's not about religion, which it's not.
That sure was crazy.
We're not going to go there again. I don't think this is a game about the allegory of the cave. And then that might sound crazy here in the same kind of way as my Talos Principle belief does, but I don't think this is a game that's specifically about allegory of the cave. I think it's like a quick nod, like, hey, by the way, that cool concept is there too. Let's just give props real quick. I think this is really a Sisyphean, whatever. I don't know how you, whatever. Sisyphean story, and I think the title does make sense because the character, the protagonist, very well may be Sisyphean in nature. The reborn aspect is when I guess you choose to do something unique and then you find that watercolor tree place and ostensibly get new options available to you as opposed to your repetitive life. And the phrase or the word reborn oftentimes comes with new chances, new options, new opportunities, whatever.
Yeah, the game, by implying that it's about Sisyphus, saying that if only he had rolled the boulder like faster or to the left and then he would have been free. It really, I think, defeats like when they were saying the choices between digging and standing, I was like, okay, this is actually a pretty interesting thing. They're not going to satisfy my desires. That's very appropriate. You have demonstrated the Sisyphean experience. Good on you, game. This is tough. I don't enjoy it, but I get what you're doing. When there's a secret third option to break free and get a watercolor tree and your person escapes into a higher level of existence, it's like, well, no. Now you're just kind of a normal story. Like everyone else is sheep, but you are smarter. You're just an escapist fantasy, but dressed up a little bit differently.
So, I agree with your overall assessment. I think it's worth saying here, I chose to do this through the realm of nihilism because I just think it's easier that way. But you could equally make the argument it's an existentialist game. So like, existentialism is basically dealing with the same problem, right? Like, how do you find purpose in a world that's inherently purposeless? That's absurd. So the sort of Sisyphean aspect of this is that, all right, Sisyphus's life would have been meaningful if he just posited its meaning himself, right? Like Zeus gave him this task and said, like, Sisyphus, this is a meaningless task I'm giving you. And Sisyphus's choice was to say, nah, Zeus, you don't know what you're talking about. This is meaningful because I say it is. I love
Sisyphus. Rolling boulders. I'd be doing this anyway, Zeus.
So, like, that's where the Sisyphus reborn is here, right? Like, Sisyphus is reborn in his acceptance that, okay, this is meaningful because I say it is. I as an individual.
Sure,
but like we said, right, this is a game that sort of goes up to that point and then ultimately rejects it at the final turn and says, like, nah, not everything's equally meaningful. Like, there's an element beyond just your declaration, your will toward meaning.
Yeah. So I think that's appropriate. And now let's talk about Port of Call.
Well, hold on. I have one more thing about Sisyphus Reborn. There were 3 quotes I wanted to examine, and maybe this doesn't take a long – I don't think this should take a long time, but It's an idea that is really important to me as well.
Pretty simple. We'll probably move through it pretty fast.
I quit protocol real fucking fast. Not like I just we'll talk about that too. But so the quotes that stood out to me were all three said by the person in the pyramid.
He's the only one who talks, really.
Yeah, the only one that really gives you any kind of like narrative push. Three quotes. One that says, "We have a choice to dig or not to dig. That choice gives us purpose." I'm not going to examine it that much, just sort of keep it in mind. The next quote is, "Once you had come here, this was the only possible path." So this one has a lot of like meaning to me, and we'll jump back to quote 1, which says, "We have a choice to dig or not to dig. That choice gives us purpose." I do think of myself as an agent of my own will, and I do derive meaning from my choices, but that's a luxury that I get for being a proponent of free will, as opposed to those people who are living it real boring in determinist and even in some cases compatibilist land. But the quote that I want to stress the most is, "We appear to have no end to our time, so all action is meaningless." Now I want to so look at them all in context. Quote 2, "Once you had come here, this was the only possible path." I kind of agree with this, and it's kind of weird to think of that in terms of a free will supporter. The way that I view space-time is compatible with this. I support the idea, because it's not only mine. I shouldn't say I came up with it, but I support the idea that as soon as the present comes about, it's kind of like locked in place and cemented in place. But if you were to graph a function like mathematically and start in future and trace a line back to the y-axis, which would be the present. So let's just pause and get our math brains around that fucking bullshit picture. Right? Start in the future and trace a line back to the y-axis.
Oh, okay.
There's an asymptotic relationship.
Oh, no.
With how, like, the possibilities of the future come, like, careening towards us. Once the present actually obtains, only one thing happened, and the tense is important. And once it happened, that is the only possible like course of history. But if you take any increment of distance on the x-axis moving forward into what is ostensibly the future, you cross that asymptote, and now it's uncertainty, and that's where our choices matter. So I think our choices have meaning because once a choice is made, it is then solidified. And yes, I can have done otherwise. Going back to the third quote, "We appear to have no end to our time, so all action is meaningless." I would agree with this too. This is an important part of my ontology. If I, for example, am an immortal, am a timeless being, then yes, all of my actions do lose meaning, because the whole purpose of my choices is making the most out of what little time that I have, and the fact that I will inevitably perish means that the good days that I have and the bad days that I have get a scale on which to measure, because I have a finite number of days, so you can compare them.
Why couldn't you compare them if they were infinite?
Because after infinitum, there's it's just all an average, right? I don't have to worry about having bad days. Bad days lose meaning because there will be an infinite number of bad days and an infinite number of good days and an infinite number of neutral days. But
I'd follow from that.
What?
That doesn't logically follow. You can have an infinite number of days and they all be bad.
No,
Sisyphus has an infinite
what I'm
number
saying
of days
is
and they're all bad.
I'm
Sisyphus
saying
started to enjoy things at about the 1000th year.
You could once
then it was
you
all
have
rainbows.
Once you have an infinite number of days, and it is possible to have Sorry, okay, I think you might be right that logically it doesn't follow perfectly that there is going to be an infinite number of good days and an infinite number of bad days, but if there's any split where like they're randomly generated and you could have a shitty life where only 5% of your days are good days, and that you stretch that to infinity, at the end of infinity, which can't be reached, you have an infinite number of bad days and an infinite number of good days and an infinite number of neutral days, and that is meaningless. But if I have a finite number of days, I would prefer to have more good days than bad days. And so
what sort of ridiculous existence has a random distribution of good and bad days?
You're just splitting hairs on that one topic. It doesn't matter. I was just saying if we have an infinite number of days that would behave like our days are currently. Let's just say that. If we have an infinite number of days that behave similarly to our days now.
Yes.
Then at the end of infinity, which again can't be reached, we would have an infinite number of good days, an infinite number of bad days, and it'd be a zero sum. So why do anything? But yeah, that's how infinity works.
Completely wrong too. Yeah, no, I'm not disagreeing with the math. I'm disagreeing with your decision to split from individual days, which very much matter whether they're good or bad, to an average of all their days. Who looks at things like?
I'm not saying average.
Oh, I had an average week.
I'm not saying average of all their days. I'm saying if you just put a binary, was this day good or bad,
right,
and you get infinity of them,
yes,
after infinity days, you will have infinity quantity good days and infinity quantity bad days.
Yeah, I don't understand the jump from that to thus our actions are meaningless if we have infinite time.
And we will never know the answer to that question because we have to discuss Port of Call.
All right, yeah, we'll leave it at that. I wanted to touch on that because it was important to me, and I would feel like I didn't finish talking about Sisyphus Reborn if we didn't talk about it.
That's fine. And if you want to hear the end of this,
write us an email.
He's going to be releasing a mixtape that we will put out special.
No, I'm not.
It'll be distributed directly to Billy's trash can.
Yeah.
But, anyone who's there can listen to it. So, Port of Call. Pete, why don't you discuss it? Because Billy talked a lot and he probably needs water.
Sure. So, Port of Call, you're on a boat, and basically it's the ferry across the river Styx, right? The ferryman's, he's not cheering, like they never say that, but he is. And you have to go around to these people who you very quickly realize are dead. And basically, you resolve their problems, right? They're sort of, what would you call them? Resentments from their life to get their ticket, which you can then give to Chiron, and he can continue to advance across the river Styx. Yeah.
Yep, and you slowly realize each of these dead people. Well, you don't realize it. You talk to 3 different people.
Yeah, they all tell you over and over again.
A little girl who's like, she died in a toy chest.
Yeah, basically like the way kids used to get trapped in refrigerators sometimes. Basically that, but with a toy chest.
She gets trapped in a toy chest and dies because her brother never found her. And then a man drank himself to death because his daughter died and his wife died. And then he basically kills himself by drinking. And then there's a woman who died in a hospital, like waiting for someone who was like taking care of her.
Mm-hmm.
And it turns out you were the brother and the son of the guy who drank himself to death, and your wife was the person who died in the hospital.
Ooh.
And you tried to kill yourself, and so now you're here in this purgatory kind of making peace with all of the different people you wronged in your life who you caused to die, basically, inadvertently.
Yeah.
And then you come face to face with your shadow self, who is in the boiler.
Yes, he is the boiler man.
The boilerman of the ship, and he basically tells you, "Oh, it's your fault that all these people are dead. You shouldn't have done the things." Ooh. It's basically the ghost of Christmas future.
Yeah.
Who's there telling you what a bad man you've been. And then...
You've been a bad boy.
You've been a bad boy, and you have to decide whether you want to die and be with your dead loved ones or go back to life, because I guess this is a metaphor for, you tried to kill yourself, but you're not quite dead yet.
Yes.
You're in limbo.
Yes.
and you can choose whether to live or die. What did you choose?
I chose die, I think, just because I was sort of curious what was going to happen.
What happens?
Nothing. The game ends.
Great.
Yeah.
Billy, did you choose live?
Yeah, I chose the same ending as Sisyphus Reborn, and I think
These games were a half hour and they were free.
I know, right?
Yeah.
Like, there was no stakes. None.
I mean, look, again,
You played
Like,
Enter the Gungeon forever, for infinite time.
I didn't play a Gungeon for infinite time.
Fine.
Did you play
Dead Cells.
Gungeon for longer than an hour?
Yeah,
Well,
Well, what are we doing here?
Gungeon was fun. This game was not. This game, we're going to talk about that when we get to the discussion about should games like this be made. I think no.
I disagree. I think yes, but I would say the most interesting part of this game for me was making the drinks, because the guy says what he wants, and you have to be his bartender and make him drinks when you want to get the drunkard's ticket, and the bottles for the drinks that he wants are not labeled properly. They're just allusions to what they are, and you have to figure out what he wants.
you need to know gin's made out of juniper berries.
You need to know that tonic is quinine.
Yes. Do you know why it's quinine?
To help defend against malaria
Yes.
carrying mosquitoes.
There you go.
And gin was added to make quinine tolerable because it tastes like garbage.
It's great
So-
when you have to add gin to something to make it taste better, because
Yeah, right.
gin by itself is like
Not delicious.
gin's pretty rough as
Also
it is.
bad.
So
I
here's.
learned all of this from a Too Mellow song, by the way.
I don't think
One-
we have.
Friend
Voice
the
of a
show, Too
generation.
Mellow.
I don't think
Yeah.
there's too much to say about this game in the abstract, right? But what I wanted us to play, why I brought it in, is because I wanted to ask a specific question here. Is there a video game equivalent of the short story? Because I feel like that's what these games are basically trying to be. Right? They're trying to be sort of short stories in and of themselves. Like, you can have short games, you can have simple games, but there's a big difference between Tetris and a short, narratively driven game. And that's what I want to ask. Is it possible to have a short story game?
Yes.
Yes. I think it is.
No.
And usually, no?
I'm going to say no.
Okay.
You guys go ahead.
So I would say yes, because I think that short narrative experiences between a half hour and an hour that tell a discrete and complete story can be, it's a nice size and length, and you can do enough storytelling in that amount of time that you can convey a significant idea. Though I think it has to be significantly simpler than a short story that would be the equivalent of like 10 pages, because you just have to do so much more work in games to kind of get people through in an hour. Whereas as long as someone can read, they will be able to get through, 10 pages of short story.
It'll take me a lot longer than an hour.
For 10 pages?
Oh, yeah.
I guess
Really?
it depends on the story.
Yeah.
I'm a real slow read.
All right,
Okay.
whatever. Neither here nor there.
Regardless, neither here nor there. But I think that it's a little bit harder in games to convey that big of a idea. Like, I remember reading a bunch of short stories in middle school, high school, college, and for the most part, you can create an entire world. It feels like in a lot of ways in a few pages. Though, I guess video games, they are a pretty dense medium, so I don't know that it's impossible. It just feels like a lot of these short story games that we played, especially these two, were kind of made cheaply and quickly
Mm-hmm.
on a small budget. I don't know quickly. Definitely cheaply.
Definitely cheaply, yeah.
And so
I mean,
they
they gave them for
skimped on
free.
stuff. And they were for free. Like, you can't question the price point. Although I will later. I think that those elements just make it such that it's hard for me to perceive what it would look like, or imagine what it would look like if the amount of effort that goes into a AAA game was put into a tight hour.
Mm-hmm.
But I think it can be done, and I think that it's something that would be useful, especially for people as they get older and have less time for games. If someone could, make a game that just gets to the point very quickly and wraps it up without having the repetitiveness that a lot of games rely on. the loops that gameplay generally uses.
So I will say yes. Video game versions of short stories exist. Why? I've played Journey. Argument done.
How long is Journey?
60 minutes, maybe.
60 minutes to 2 hours. And it's once you've played Journey, you don't need to play anything that's the hero's journey ever again. Fuck Star Wars. Fuck the Lord of the Rings. Don't play any of those. Just play Journey.
Yeah, pretty. I mean, yeah, that's not objectively false. So I think maybe Pete and I are gonna at some points along this conversation disagree. But my first sort of post here is: can a video game version of a short story exist? Yes. Journey is a great example. Other games like Journey exist. You can make a video game. Yeah, Flower is also short, but there's not much narrative in Flower. There is narrative in Journey. I'll say games like Flow and Flower, they're governed by rules, and they have a win state, which our friend Tyler Morgan one time told me that was like a loose and not perfect definition of what a game needs to be. So Tyler told me what defines a game. He's like, careful, this is not a perfect definition. Like the gaming community knows this is not perfect, but he says a game can be loosely thought of as governed by rules and have a win state. Philosophical analogy, if you think about JTB for epistemology, people used to think that having knowledge could be defined in 3 words. It was a justified true belief, and then we figured out that was not a perfect model for knowledge. Similarly, a video game could be sort of described as an interactive experience governed by rules, and it has a win state. Not a perfect definition, but it serves most of our needs. Flower and Flow are those, but they're not necessarily narrative like a short story. So I'd say Journey of that game company trilogy, Journey can be a short story, but Flow and Flower would not be a short story.
Sure. So, Pete.
So here's why I say no, and mostly because if we all said yes, it would be a pretty boring conversation. But I don't necessarily think that like they can't exist. But the fact that there's a fundamental tension within sort of creating the short story game between length and gameplay, right? Like in order to create a sufficiently complex game, you just need X amount of time in order to introduce gameplay mechanics. So there's a fundamental tension between the length of the game and the complexity you can create within that length, right? Now, if you want to use that time in order to advance the story, there's necessarily a trade-off for even more gameplay, right? So you're cutting time. You could introduce gameplay mechanics, thereby using it for story. And I get, like, these are broad strokes, right? You can do both at the same time in certain cases. But there seems to be a fundamental tension between how complex you can make a game and how long that game could be, such that you can't really have a complex short story game in the same way that you can create that complexity in a short story itself due to, let's say, the greater information density of the story as a medium.
So I would push back a little bit on the
notion
that within an hour or two you cannot have complex gameplay. I think that if you wanted to do that, you would have to be more radical about how your game is structured than even the games we played. Because the games we played, it was largely point and click and a little bit of movement.
Mm-hmm.
The controls were very simple. If you wanted to make a more complex game that has a runtime of an hour or two, the way you would have to do it would be to front load or cut out. To front load a lot of the education, or to cut out the education and cut out some of the natural curves that you would expect on a normal progression loop. So, for example, if you wanted to make a role-playing game, right, that encompassed a short story, and you wanted a role-playing combat system or something, right, like that style of gameplay,
sure,
you would have to remove random encounters. Like, you'd have to remove this kind of fundamental repetitive action. You might only be able to have 1 or 2 battles. And you could also have the depth of those battles be high, but you would have to communicate that information either outside of the game or in some sort of menu. you would not be able to do the kind of organic rollout that a lot of games prefer, where you're kind of tutorializing over hours so that people are kind of slowly getting ramped up to the game until they can play it. You're going to have to kind of front load this information somewhere. Like, it's got to be a data dump,
Yeah,
and then
Gino,
people
that's
just kind of jump in.
now you're changing the definition of where the game starts. At that point, I would say the game starts with when you, like, if you offload that off-site, the game starts when you go off-site to read this information. It doesn't start when you boot up the CD, let's say.
And I think that that's fair. However, I think that the argument – I think that short stories already do that. And here's why. A lot of short stories, you need to have a larger understanding about the context of the writer, the world in which they're writing in, the era they're writing with, some of the vocabulary that they use, especially if they are making up kind of their own words in their own setting. Some of those elements are things that are intrinsically offloaded onto the reader to have the full context and the full appreciation of the story. And that's something that we accept in short story writing or in, most literature. That's a burden that we as informed readers kind of expect and are okay with. With games, we always treat the player or almost always, we treat the player as though they are new to games and do not have an understanding of even how the controller might work, let alone how it works in the context of your game. And if you started assuming that the player who is playing your game is experienced in the genre that your game happens to be, you might be able to get around some of these teaching moments and these slow curves. Now, it will be inherently less welcoming than if you had gone with a simpler form, but it's something that you might be able to get away with. Like, if you put me in front of a game that was basically a JRPG and gave me no tutorial, I might not make the ideal choices, but I'd know how to play it. I would know what to do, and I could figure it out probably within the hour or two that we would define a short story. But no one does that because it's not considered good gameplay development. It's not considered good gameplay or development practice. But if you get more radical with it and start making assumptions of the audience and expect that they will come to your game with some expertise in the act of playing games, not just in terms of like having some interest in your narrative, I think you can do both. It's just harder, and it would require a reinvention of how you kind of design the game.
Okay, so basically our disagreement here is we're both saying, all right, the length limits the amount you can necessarily include, the amount of complexity you can get to. You're saying, no, you can still include enough, and I'm saying, I don't think you really can.
Yeah, I'm basically saying I think that the choice is false. I think you just have to make a different assumption about who your audience is and how they're going to approach your game, which other genres already do.
When you say the choice is false, do you mean to say that it's not true that the shorter a game is, the less you can necessarily include?
I think the amount of content will be less, but the amount of actual relevant decisions and relevant gameplay might not be. Like, there are some repetitive loops in lots of games that pad out the length, but do not fundamentally change the experience.
Yeah,
If you only had 5 missions in Assassin's Creed,
right,
and told the same story, instead of 30 copies of each of the same 5 missions, you would tell the same story. You might be able to condense it to 2 or 3 hours, and yes, there would be less of it, and yes, it would be a different experience, but you might be able to convey largely the same feeling. It might even be tighter. It might even be better. I don't know. I've never seen a game attempt that, but I think that it's possible.
I would disagree. But I see what you're saying. It's a legitimate argument.
Yeah, like if it was like a boss rush game, right?
Yeah.
If it was something like Fury.
Right.
Fury can be beaten in like 2 hours. It's really deep. Mm-hmm. That game's combat is really deep. There's a lot. It'd be very hard to beat it in 2 hours if you were coming to it straight. But you could imagine a Fury that was 10 hours long and had a bunch of battles in between the boss fights.
Right.
Instead, they just say it's all boss fights. Go.
But you can't imagine an Ocarina of Time that's an hour long. You just can't fit it.
No, that's a very yeah, but I also can't imagine a Lord of the Rings that's a short story.
Yeah, that's what I'm
I
saying.
think that we're comparing most games that we've experienced are novels,
Right.
the equivalent of novels, whereas we have played very few games that are short stories and intend to be short stories.
Yeah,
Actually,
my
I'd
point
say
is
on
playing
this
with a systematic
podcast,
reason.
we've played probably most of the good games that are like our short story candidates on this podcast.
We played a few of them, yeah.
I'd say like probably more like I actually, while you guys were talking about this, did like a Google search of like top something games you can finish in one day, and we've played like 8 out of 10 of them.
1 day's a long ass time.
Which ones? What is this list?
Inside, Firewatch, Limbo.
Firewatch is a pretty long game. So is Limbo.
What? No, you can beat those games
which
in
one
a day.
am I thinking of? Yeah, day's a long time.
Journey.
What's Limbo? Which one's Limbo?
Limbo's the one
Is
where
that the caravan one?
no,
No,
Limbo's
it's
the
the
one
before
where
Inside.
I'm thinking of
By
the
the makers of
caravan
Inside.
one. All right, yeah, Limbo's short.
yeah, it's like we've
Firewatch.
played a lot of these games, and I've played a lot of the ones that we haven't played on this podcast, but are on the list too. Firewatch, Gone Home, Abzu, which is it's made by the same people that made Flow, Flower, and Journey. Like, games can totally be short stories. They already are.
So, Pete, what were you trying to say?
I forget.
Well, let's ask the other question. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. Sorry.
No, it's fine. I think this argument is pretty much. I think we've hit it from all angles.
Yeah.
We
Some
can
of
ask
us
the
also.
other questions. Should these games exist? I want to answer that from two perspectives. Should, like, capital case, these games exist? Yes, because games that are short and tell a story should exist. The games that I listed should exist. Should Sisyphus, Reborn, and Protocol exist? I wish they didn't have to exist. Maybe that they should not exist. That might be too far, but I wish they didn't have to exist.
What possible reason could you have? They were they were free. It's not as if Steam is running out of bandwidth.
True. So let me try to explain.
We spent like an hour discussing each of them, so they clearly inspired at least something.
This is it. Yeah, this is it. So the three of us here, right?
Right.
We all know like what kind of education background we came from and what we were exposed to, both in high school and college. And I was a philosophy major. Pete, you were too. Gino, maybe you weren't an actual major, but you've been exposed to higher order thought. You could have all, and you probably have already, had all the thoughts that these games were trying to make you think about by yourself in some other setting.
Sure, but
Correct?
I don't think that the existence of other media that is of a higher quality or a different distribution invalidates other forms.
It's not
Here's
like
what I
Enter
have
the
a problem
Gungeon made
with.
me have any thoughts.
I think that these thoughts, these like thought-provoking lines of inquiry, need to be had with another person or like a group to be explored in community. And the fact that they are presented in game form, that it's basically single player unless you're doing it with a person next to you and they're watching and playing along with you, is getting so little out of these lines of inquiry because they're best followed when there's people to explore and challenge your ideas with. So I'm not regretting that they exist because maybe some people would never come across these lines of inquiry if they didn't have Sisyphus Reborn. But I wish that those people had better opportunities to think this way that were not Sisyphus Reborn.
Okay. I mean, I don't think either of these games are must-plays, but I think that they are valid attempts at creating short, narrative-driven games that tackle some questions that games don't always tackle.
I think Billy's rewriting philosophical history in an irresponsible way.
Oh yeah, baby.
Please no.
No,
Don't discuss why.
it'll be short. Philosophy has a long and illustrious history of people thinking in solitude that Billy's just sort of disregarded. That's it. That's the whole comment.
And that's why next game we're playing Walden, the video game. No. So, At some point, the running joke of picking Walden the video game.
We'll just have to.
We're gonna have to play Walden the video game.
You know what it'll be? It'll be like a bonus for next year's endurance run. Donate enough, we'll finally fucking play Walden.
Oh man! Now you've said it out loud into a microphone. Now we're gonna have to
Spoken
fuck
into existence.
Oh boy.
So, one question I wanted to ask is: these games are both free, and
Yes.
what do you think of that price point? Because even though these games are very simple, and graphically, they're not the most stunning games you've ever played. There was still labor done to create these games.
Sure.
They still have value. We've talked about them for an hour. We've gotten as much value out of discussing them as they took to play.
Mm-hmm.
And a fraction of a fraction of the time it took them to make. What do you feel about a marketplace where a game experience, like the short story as game, I think 0 is the right price point if you want people to play it, and that kind of says a sad thing about how we value these kinds of experiences.
I would love if both of these developers could make money off these games. I would love that. I would also not pay a cent more than $0 for either of these games.
Yeah.
I think these games fit best in a scenario like a Humble Bundle, where you can choose to, this game needs a tip jar.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a solid point, Billy. That's a good comparison.
Yeah, and I think a tip jar kind of format, a la, the Doki Doki Literature Club and other similar games, I think that model works. But I just hate the idea that there are developers out there who are making products that people are playing and enjoying and getting experience out of, that we have said, that the marketplace has said, this is not worth any money, and your existence should be supported on the good graces of a handful of your fans who will actually pay you. Because
isn't that like a huge part of art?
Yeah, and it's still shitty.
Yeah.
It's always been shitty. It's always created these new restrictions on artists and on their existences that I think in a society as advanced as our current one and as wealthy as our current one, I don't think that you should be living off of the good graces of a patron.
There we go, an obligatory
And
call
that's why
for
we're
socialism.
That's why we're starting
Art
our
communism? Throwing back?
Segue. That's why we're starting our Patreon.
Yes.
Please help us.
This was the announcement video for the Deep Listens tip jar.
I've already quit my job. There's no turning back now.
But look, so Gino, yeah, people are going to make art and not get paid for it. That's not going to change. Is it shitty? Yeah, but that kid who's not getting paid anything to make that mixtape that is fire, like through the adversity of not getting paid, like the determination of making the art for the art's sake, that's the mixtape that's fire and that people.
That's not true.
What a dangerous argument.
That's not true at all.
I'm just trying to inspire every person who's written in a YouTube comment, hey, check out my mixtape. Like that person needs to know that I believe in them.
I don't think that the hunger is what's making them make the art. Maybe if they had a full belly, they
ask
could
the
make more
artist,
of it.
Gino, what they would say.
I'm just going to go out on a limb and say I don't think that
maybe
Steph
he doesn't
Curry.
want to be paid, Gino.
Yeah, I don't think that Steph Curry growing up in the lap of luxury hurt him. I don't think it made him worse at basketball. I don't think that LeBron growing up in a background where he had struggles that he needed to escape constantly so that he could become the man he is today helped him get better at basketball. I think both of them were great coming from completely different backgrounds, but one of them was always full, and that probably helped. Okay, that's the end of my rant.
YouTube mixtape kid. I got your back.
This podcast went in a weird direction. I liked it.
No, this podcast is what every podcast should be.
This podcast got weird. I'm happy. Thank you for picking these weird games, Pete.
No problem.
Thank you, Billy.
Thanks for listening. I can't wait to edit out all of your guys' rebuttals to my flawless arguments.
Just a lot of silence.
Yeah, it's gonna be weird gaps of nothingness. Kind of like Sisyphus Reborn.
Fair. So it is my turn to pick a game.
Good.
And I'm super happy because we're going to play, I think, our first game that came out this year.
Woo. It's only August.
Only August. We usually mop it up towards the end of the year because there's more year to have played games from.
Yeah.
The later in the
Yeah,
year.
you know.
And it's a new game that just came out, Flipping Death.
Okay.
Billy, you remember this from when we went to PAX. It's
Yeah.
out now.
Ooh.
And I want to play that game. It is
Yeet.
from the people who made Stick It to the Man, which was a game that I liked, and
Not a
apparently
good
no one
title.
else. Yeah, Stick It to the Man is kind of a Psychonazi game, and Flipping Death is also kind of Psychonazi in both kind of reading people's minds and also the aesthetic and kind of the sense of humor. So
I
I'm
do remember
looking
this
forward to
game.
it.
Yeah.
I like this. I liked what I played of this game at PAX a whole lot.
I'm pumped.
So we're going to play some Flippin' Death. All right. So just a reminder, if you want to get in touch with the show, do so at DeepListensPod, deeplistens.libsyn.com. We've got comment sections, and they're probably working now. And deeplistenspodcast@gmail.com. Or you can write on our YouTube comments, and we'll probably check there. Who knows? Thanks, everybody. Till next time, peace.